This talk is going to be really in two parts. First part is going to be about how I ended up doing what I do, about some of the places that we cover, and it's going to seem like I belong here and I'm an official person. Part two is weirder, and is about this idea that I've developed sort of doing this work and this bigger perspective on travel, which is an incredibly powerful force in the world, and how we can really use it to do good in the world, how we can make it kind of the most wonderful version of itself. But first, the first part. So ever since I was a kid, I've had this really strong sense that the world sort of had a kind of magical layer. Like if only I could kind of access a little bit deeper, I could find this sort of incredible magic that was hidden there. And I just had this very deep desire to kind of understand more, to know more, to see more. And I remember one of the first times when I was a kid where I got this sense that the world was really holding out on me. So I grew up in Minnesota, in the Midwest. I didn't grow up in a field, I grew up in a city, but this is what people imagine when I say I grew up in the Midwest. But what this meant is I wasn't doing international travel, I wasn't jetting off places. The only kinds of trips I took as a kid were road trips with my family, driving around different parts of North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin. But it was on one of these trips that I had this kind of early revelation. So on one of these trips, we drove through North Dakota and went to the Corn Palace in South Dakota. And then in Wisconsin, we stopped at this place called the House on the Rock. Has anyone ever heard of this place? Oh, a lot of you have heard of this place. Have any of you ever been to this place? Okay, so if you've been to this place, you understand what happened. So this is in the woods in the middle of Wisconsin. And it's got this great kind of legend behind it. The legend, which is almost certainly untrue, but the idea is that this architect wanted to work for Frank Lloyd Wright, who was building Taliesin, right, in the same area. And then he went and he showed him his architectural plans, and that Frank Lloyd Wright told him, "I would not hire you to build a cheese crate or a chicken coop." And, incensed, this guy went on to build his own kind of crazy architectural vision, which some might call it a sort of Frank Lloyd wrong. But that's not what interested me when I was 12 and I was walking through here. It took about 5 hours to get through this whole place. And inside this massive set of buildings is the world's largest indoor carousel with the most diverse set of carousel animals, a hallway that looks like it goes on for infinity, and a squid fighting a whale the size of the Statue of Liberty. If you've been to this place, you know that there is almost nothing else like it in the world. And as a 12-year-old, my thought was, if this is what is in the woods in Wisconsin, what else is out there in the world? And eventually, through a long winding path, I ended up starting Atlas Obscura. I started it back in 2009 with my co-founder Josh. And the idea of Atlas Obscura is a lot about that sense that I had as a kid and kind of have carried with me, which is this idea of the world is a wonder. It is filled with so much magic and beauty, and we wanted to kind of share that sense with people, to reawaken that sense of surprise and awe in this world that we all share together. And so, we didn't want to tell people about the Eiffel Tower, but we did want to tell them about the secret little apartment that's at the top of the Eiffel Tower, where Eiffel would bring up people like Thomas Edison, and they'd sit and have tea and look out over the city of Paris. Or places like this. This is the everlasting lightning storm in Venezuela. It has had a massive display of lightning going on almost every single night for hundreds and hundreds of years. We know this because someone actually tried to invade this town by ship, and it didn't work because everyone could see their ships coming and the lightning flashes. So this is still going on now. It's an incredible, unbelievable place. And my co-founder and I actually traveled there, and there's a whole, I'll tell you about that story some other time, but it was like really amazing to find these places that you'd say, "Have you ever heard of this?" And people would say, "No idea what you're talking about." This was another one of these places. This is the Gates of Hell in Turkmenistan. It's a 350-foot wide hole in the middle of the desert. And at first, it looks a little bit like the mouth of a volcano, some kind of natural occurrence. But it is not. It is in fact the product of a sort of industrial accident. So in the 1970s, Soviet petroleum geologists were here in Turkmenistan looking for natural gas, and they found it. It's a hugely rich natural gas area. So they set up their drilling rig, but they made a mistake because unfortunately when they punctured through the surface of the desert, the entire rig fell into the ground, creating this enormous crater. And they had a second problem, which is that the crater was leaking. They had found natural gas. It was leaking natural gas, which is deadly if you are suffocated by it, or explosive. And so they did the sensible thing. They lit the hole on fire. It has been burning for about 50 years now. It is on fire now. As I am speaking to you right now, that hole is out there burning away in the middle of the desert. We wanted to tell these kinds of stories. This is a place that I actually stumbled across, or really an object I stumbled across when I was living in Hungary, in Budapest. This is in Florence, in Italy, and it's at the History of Science Museum. And the History of Science Museum is incredible. And it's filled with all of these, huge armillary spheres, giant old telescopes, all of this equipment. And then there's this one little human fragment, this little mummified finger. This is Galileo's middle finger. Which, if you know much about how Galileo and the church got along, it's sort of sensible that he left it behind, Yeah, and so this is actually, and since we stumbled across this and we wrote about it, they've actually found this was taken off of Galileo's body about 100 years after he died by basically an admirer, someone who wanted to kind of venerate him like a saint. And other sort of relics were also taken, and they're slowly being recollected by the museum, so they've got a couple vertebrae, they've got a few other fingers, like give them enough time and they'll just have a whole new Galileo there. But, stories, and they didn't have to be far away places too. A lot of this stuff turned out to be really close to home too. So this is in New Mexico, and these are Raw Paulette's caves. Now Raw Paulette was an artist who didn't really find his medium until he was well into middle age. And it turned out that his artist medium is caves. And so he goes out and he finds these natural sandstone caves and then spends months, years, sculpting them into these elaborate, incredible pieces of art. And many of them are hidden in the desert. He won't tell people where they are. He's just done them and left them there, maybe for someone to find one day. These were the kinds of stories that got us really excited. This is a story about a place, it's about way in the middle of nowhere. It's off the coast of Australia. And this is called Ball's Pyramid. And it's a huge rock spire that would be fascinating in its own right. It's about twice as tall as the Empire State Building, and it's quite a barren, imposing place. It's the little remains of an extinct volcano. But that's not actually the story that was really amazing about this place, because this was a popular place for climbers to go and practice their climbing. And the climbers noticed something unusual. People didn't think anything lived on this island, but they noticed that under some little bushes, they saw evidence that something was living there. And no one paid much attention to this until two entomologists found out about it in the late 90s. And they got really excited because next to this island, about 11 kilometers away, there's another island called Lord Howe Island. Lord Howe Island was once home to this enormous bug called the Lord Howe Island stick insect. But no one had seen one in 80 years. They'd been marked extinct in 1920. The thought was that rats had gotten onto the island and basically eaten every last of these bugs. But these entomologists went and they climbed up, and about 1,000 feet up this rock spire, they found this. They found the last 24 Lord Howe Island stick insects, making it the rarest insect in the world at that point. The entire population lived under basically one bush on that big rock spire. And eventually they were able to get a breeding pair off, and they are now, whether you like it or not, producing many more Lord Howe Island stick insects. And the idea is actually to reintroduce them ultimately to Lord Howe Island, which, good for the people there. They're bravely accepting their their new neighbors. If you want a little palate cleanser, because not everyone's a fan of gigantic bugs, there's also a cat island in Japan, where there's like 100 cats per individual, and dogs are not allowed, obviously. So this was the project. This was the big project of building this world map of places with incredible, surprising, interesting stories to tell. And we launched back in 2009, really almost as an art project. We just wanted this thing to exist in the world. We wanted to have it as a resource for our own travel. They're not, a lot of the places in it are not quite as wild as some of those. And so, we just decided, what if we put this out there? We filled it with all of the places that we thought were amazing, unusual, and we asked other people to do the same, to basically submit and say, hey, here's a place we think belongs in Atlas Obscura. And it seemed to work. People seemed to understand what we wanted, what we were looking for in the world. And so this project has been kind of my focus for really the last 15 years of my life. And we have kind of, as we built the map, we expanded into other mediums. So obviously there are the books. This is the first edition of the adult book and the kids book, and it's not pictured here, but Gastro Obscura is the book that came out most recently about food. But we also wanted to expand this mission of sharing wonder in other ways too. So I will say one thing about the kids book. I went on a book tour for that, which meant going into schools. And once you've talked to like 300 seventh graders, no other audience will ever scare you again. That is the most frightening group of people to try to present to. So that was good for me, that was good. We wanted to expand this in other ways too, though. So we started doing events and taking people to interesting places. This is an event, it's a sleepover we did at the Explorers Club in New York, where people got to see artifacts from Antarctic and Arctic expeditions and just experience kind of all these incredible things. We started running trips. So we run about 120 group trips around the world. This is one of the very first trips we did to Bulgaria in the middle of winter, which was like a questionable choice, but people came, and we went specifically actually to see things like this. This is called Bazludza, and it is maybe the greatest abandoned communist monument in the world. And in fact, it's a really rich category, especially in certain parts of Eastern Europe. This was once this incredibly lavish building. It was the headquarters of the Bulgarian Communist Party. And then when communism fell, it was just abandoned on this mountaintop. And so now it looks like this inside. And it's just this kind of unbelievable place. We go to places like Salina Turda, which is in Romania, and it's an old salt mine that has been transformed into a kind of underground amusement park. We go to places like, this is the monarch migration path in Mexico. So we go back to where all the monarch butterflies eventually return to on this like multi-generational trip that they make back to Mexico. This is an incredible thing. We go, and this is actually you'll see the same person in both of these because he's our scientist and our guide. And we go and places like the Amazon where we stay with local scientists and we learn how they do the work that they do. And what it takes to kind of preserve these wild places. And travelers are very much encouraged to make friends of many different kinds, including this one. So for some people, this is called a whiptail scorpion, which sounds terrifying, but actually can't hurt you at all. They have no way to bite you or sting you. They are very big. And of course, some people were not at all excited about having one crawl on their face, but for other people, this was literally the best part of their whole trip. This is like the thing that they had been waiting for. So yeah, that is what I have spent the last decade of my adult life doing. Building this map, growing this community, creating these travel experiences, trying to share that sense of surprise and awe and wonder in the world. And all of this had a sort of unintended consequence, which is that it brought me into the world of travel in a way that I never quite expected. I always liked travel, I always wanted to travel and write about travel, but I came to sort of understand the travel industry in a much bigger way doing this work. And I think it's a surprisingly misunderstood part of the economy, considering it's so big. So this is part two. Now we're going to get to part two about how all of this kind of strange, weirdo places relates to kind of a bigger thing about travel, and how I think we can all be sort of better travelers in the world. So tourism, this is a great quote, tourism has become one of the most powerful, most influential, and least examined forces in the world. I think that is highly true. Tourism generates over 10% of all global economic activity. It's responsible for 1 in 5 new jobs created over the last 5 years. And obviously the pandemic had some effect on that. But we're already back up to 25% higher levels of travel than pre-pandemic. Travel is this enormous, enormous piece of the global economy. And it's growing faster than the global economy year after year. And so travel is changing the world in ways that are both good and bad. And so like, this is Trolltunga in Norway, which is this really beautiful rock outcropping overlooking, this incredible lake. And here one brave soul has ventured out to the very edge. It's a photo of true solitude in nature. Okay, so maybe more than one brave soul has done it. A few people have done it. Because in fact, if you go to Trolltunga, it looks like this. It's really a giant line for an Instagram photo. And I think sometimes we hold these very romantic visions in our head. We think of Barcelona looking like this incredibly beautiful, romantic place, or Dubrovnik in Croatia like this, or Venice. I mean, what place could be more romantic than Venice, Italy? But if you go there, especially during high season, it's actually like this. So Venice gets 60,000 visitors every day during its high season. Venice has 55,000 residents. So it gets more visitors per day than its total number of residents. This is Dubrovnik. So during the main tourist season in Dubrovnik, it takes 40 minutes to walk through a 300-meter long pedestrian zone. Or in Barcelona, where 750 cruise ships docked last year, the locals have gotten a little bit irritated with this process. So it's not working out for everyone everywhere. There's some friction happening out there in the world of travel. And how did this happen? How did we get to this place? And this is basically why. In 1960, 25 million people traveled internationally. That number passed 1 billion in 2013 and will be 2 billion by 2030. The sheer volume of international travel has just grown and grown and grown, and will continue to. You can see in this chart here, and again, pandemic and geopolitics has had effects on this, but you can watch the Chinese middle class just rocket as outbound international travelers. So this effect is growing all across the world. And you're going to keep seeing kind of some of these frictions arise as more and more travel takes place, as more and more kind of middle class markets open up, China and India particularly. So, for a word that didn't exist 5 years ago, this idea of over-tourism, how to manage kind of places like Venice and Barcelona that are getting crushed, it has become a pretty salient question in the world of travel and travel media. And I think, like I said, even pandemic aside, like these issues are here to stay, and they're going to keep coming up. And some of this, what I realized as I ended up sort of in the travel media space is like travel media plays a particular role in this too. Like what sort of happens in travel media is someone finds a new place, it's Portugal, it's Tulum in Mexico. Someone writes about it, then everyone writes about it, then the place, gets more and more and more travelers until basically it becomes a terrible experience for the locals, for the travelers, and then everyone stops writing about it. But like that seems to be the cycle in travel media. It's a very kind of like follow the leader approach. And it's not as if anyone is doing it on purpose, but it's this kind of emergent property. It reminds me, I love how baby names work because they're like this. Like, so no one decides like, okay, this is the year we're gonna all name the baby the same thing, but then one year just everyone is named Lisa, And so it's one of these sort of zeitgeisty things just happen. Yeah, there's Jennifer, right? So you look up and suddenly there's just Jennifers everywhere you go. And currently Barcelona is a Jennifer. And so it's not great. And so, so we gotta, what can we do about this? How do we solve this problem that we're creating by encouraging travel, which is fundamentally, I believe, a good, wonderful thing? And, we could all stop traveling. We tried that for the last 2 years. It wasn't great. It had some issues. I don't know if you're familiar with a Snuggie, but it's only so long you want to stay in one. One lesson of the pandemic actually is even with a global shutdown, travel didn't actually stop. People just changed how they were traveling. They drove more, they went to state parks and national parks in record numbers, and as soon as it opened up, everyone, in fact, had saved up their travel, so now are traveling even more. So there must be ways, though, to use travel as a positive force and not a negative force. And that's the thing I've been sort of focused on for the last number of years. So this is an example of an interesting place. This is a place called Kawah Ijen, and it's a sulfur mine in Indonesia. And it's hard, backbreaking work, but it has slowly been transferring into a kind of tourism destination because it's quite beautiful. And this travel is having really interesting positive impacts on this place because a lot of the miners age out of this work really quickly because it's very hard on your body. And travel has opened up interesting economic opportunities for them. In fact, travel has sort of interesting benefits beyond just these direct ones. There's very strong evidence about the connection between travel and charitable giving habits. So the World Wildlife Fund put out a bunch of surveys, and it said that people who marked that they enjoyed travel as compared to people who said they didn't were likely to contribute up to 27 times more. There was a huge disparity. Like if you like travel, you have a sort of more generous giving approach. Travel in this case has the incredible power of replacing or at least augmenting a highly extractive industry with something that can be sort of a nice counter to this as the only economic opportunity. So this is Kawah Ijen at night actually. Because it's a sulfur mine, it is constantly leaking sulfur which then ignites and forms these incredibly beautiful like blue flames. I think that this instance is actually going to end up being a really good success story for this region in Indonesia. But then it just frames like this bigger question. Can this be applied to travel more generally? How can we make travel not an extractive industry, but an additive industry? And I think, we need to build a culture around travel where we encourage things like longer stays, more off-season trips, and really building local economies. And for anyone who's been stuck in a giant crowd like this, it's not fun for locals or the traveler. So there's gotta be a way, And sometimes the answer, frankly, is like, if the question is, should I go to Venice in July? I think the answer is no. Like, you won't have a good time. But the power of this enormous economic force, this nearly $9 trillion force in the world, can do incredible good. And the interesting thing for me is working at Atlas Obscura, I've seen very much the flip side of this coin. So you have your Venices and your Barcelonas, but I get to see what happens to places that are very small and don't get much attention. And look, this is all very lofty, and really at the end of the day, I'm a guy who runs a website who tells you to go to the Clown Motel in Nevada. But the perspective that I've gotten on this is interesting because, hello, okay, good. Because the other side of the coin is, well, Venice and Barcelona are drowning in tourists. There are places like this. This is a guy named Frank Kovac, and he's actually also based in Wisconsin. And Frank Kovac built a planetarium entirely by himself from scratch. It's 22 feet in diameter, and he painted 5,000 hand-done individual stars inside of this planetarium. But basically, due to difficulty in getting the word out and getting people to come to visit his small town, Frank had to close the planetarium down and go back to work in the machine shop. I think he may be opening it up again, which is really nice, but this is a story that I run into a lot. This is a place called Smith's Mansion in Wyoming, and it was built by this wild outsider artist who actually passed away while building the building. And it was taken over by his daughter, but she couldn't sort of get it to support itself. She couldn't get enough tourism there. And so it was sold off to an unknown fate. I think it may get torn down. This is a place called Margaret's Grocery in Mississippi. And this is a really beautiful story about Margaret and her husband, Dennis. So Margaret's first husband was killed in this market in the 70s. And after being a widow for a number of years, she met this Reverend Dennis. And he said, if you marry me, I will build you a castle. And he did. He built her this incredible, strange, outsider art castle. And it was both a grocery store and a folk ministry. And it became this kind of true, unique location in Mississippi. But, eventually they both passed away. And the building began to fall into ruin. And there was sort of no body to help keep it up. And so I think it will probably ultimately end up being demolished. So, on the one hand, you have all of this sort of crazy over-tourism, and on the other hand, you have this tragedy of these little wonders quietly disappearing from the world. And there is a middle way. So one of the interesting things, speaking of the Clown Motel, is when you start telling these stories about more untraditional travel locations, something kind of funny happens. So this is in a place called Tonopah, Nevada. It's about 4 hours outside of Las Vegas. It's also, besides being a motel decorated with thousands of clowns, it's also next to an old miners' cemetery. So it's basically like Stephen King could not have made a more perfect horror site in the world. But as we told this story, something kind of wonderful started happening. People started making little pilgrimages out there. They started making a special trip and renting cars and driving out to the Clown Motel. And the reason this isn't sort of just, a silly side story is Tonopah is a tiny town. This town has 2,500 people in it, but everyone who goes out to that Clown Motel stops at the local hotel, they stop at the restaurant, they get a drink, they get something to eat, and this helps power this little town. It keeps it alive. And if a clown-themed motel in the desert next to a miners' cemetery can become a tourist destination, really anything can. And there are more profound examples of this too. This is a place that I truly love. So not long after we started the site, maybe 3 months after we launched, we got an entry into the site that said, I live in Cherrapunji, India. It's a very remote place. It's one of the wettest places in the world. And there are these things here that nobody knows about, and I'm afraid they're going to disappear. And it goes on to describe these. These are the living root bridges of Cherrapunji. So these are not built, they are grown. They are the roots of 2 Ficus elastica trees, like rubber trees, that are slowly woven together, and given enough time, about 10 or 15 years, they form this incredibly strong living bridge. This bridge is hundreds of years old. And one of the reasons these were made originally is because it is so wet here. Other kinds of construction don't really work. Other wood bridges get washed away, they rot away. The reason this bridge has a double-decker is that during the rainy season, the water goes all the way up to the bottom of that second bridge. It's also two-way traffic. But so these have no tourism industry to them, none. In fact, there was almost nothing on the internet about these. And the reason they were going to disappear is people were actually putting up steel cable bridges that, they'd rust away in 10 years, but didn't matter, they were cheap. And these bridges, people were draining the latex out of the trees. There was just no incentive for anyone to care for these. I have to say, I'm incredibly proud and happy to say that more than a decade later, that has changed. There is a whole organization now dedicated to preserving these. There is a young man named Kongtha Morningstar has led the charge of helping preserve these, and they're trying to get a national park kind of set up so that you can go to a bunch of these in kind of a big loop. And we run a trip out to these, and there are other people who are now bringing people out here, and it has a very good sustainable tourism model built around it. So for me, that is an enormous success story. I don't want to live in a world where the living root bridges disappear. I want to live in a world where they're making new living root bridges, which is happening. So there's another good example that happens also to be a bridge. This is a place I went to back in 2010 called the Quechua, sometimes known as the last Incan Bridge. So this bridge is incredible for a bunch of reasons. One, this whole bridge is woven entirely out of grass. And the fact is actually about 3 months after I was on this bridge, it was cut down. But that's okay, because that is actually exactly what's supposed to happen. Every year, the 4 villages that are in this remote region of Peru come together. They cut down an enormous amount of this grass, and they begin weaving it together. And it takes about a week to make another Quechua another bridge. But at the end, they've created a new bridge. It is strong, it slowly rots, which is why they have to replace it. The other amazing thing about that bridge, let's see if I can get my presentation back. The other amazing thing about that bridge is that is exactly how it has been made since the Incan Empire. That bridge is a tiny living piece of Incan infrastructure. It was created by the bridge master who oversaw these bridges as part of the Incans' great kind of road network across South America. And that's still how it's done today. I met the guy, his name is Victoriano, and he's the bridge master. This talk make it slightly less visual here in a second. We'll see. And so those are the kinds of places that and amazingly, it also had no tourism. It's very close to Machu Picchu, and Machu Picchu is kind of overrun with travelers, and this place had almost no one going to it. And that has also changed. They have some more tourism now, and that money is going into building a new school for everyone who lives there. So it has these kind of amazing knock-on effects. Let's see here. Let's see. Maybe I can do this without my presentation. Well, so this is what my focus of my career has been. Not just telling stories about strange and unusual places, but figuring out the middle path. How do you get people to go somewhere that's maybe a little bit strange, a little bit unusual, but in doing so, you create an opportunity for that traveler to have a true, incredible, amazing experience, and for the place to benefit from their money, their attention, and to thrive. And so that places like both the last Incan Bridge and the living root bridges can exist in this world. And there's one more place I'm going to tell you about. So on that same trip, I went to this waterfall in Peru called Gocta Falls. And Gocta was this teeny tiny little town in the middle of nowhere, Peru. But it was right at the base of this enormous waterfall. And in fact, this waterfall wasn't even on any maps. It was just sort of there. But then in 2005, a German hiker named Steven Zimmendorf came into the area. And he looked at this waterfall and he said, God, that waterfall is enormous. I wonder how tall it is. And he asked around, and it turns out no one really knew. So the next year, he came back with surveying equipment and measured the waterfall. And which, by the way, might be the most German thing anyone has ever done in their life. And it turns out that this waterfall, by some estimates, is the 3rd, 5th tallest waterfall in the world. It's certainly in the top 20. It depends on, it has a 2-tiered fall, so I'm not sure why the thing is. So this waterfall, this unbelievable world wonder, was sitting there and basically nobody knew about it, no one was paying attention to it. And I went to this town years after this was discovered. And I talked to the local residents there, and I said, you were this little town in need of economic support, you needed attention from the Peruvian government, and you had this wonder in your backyard. Why weren't you shouting to the world about it? And they said, we knew it was beautiful, we knew it was wonderful, but we figured, compared to all the other wonders of the world, how special could it really be? And to be honest, we kind of just stopped noticing it. We saw it there every day. We sort of just stopped thinking about it. And I think basically we all live at the base of Gocta Falls. We all live surrounded by these incredible, wonderful, amazing places. I had a bunch of places in Florida on here that you're not going to see, but they're very good. There's a crazy underwater cemetery where it's like 16 acres called Neptune Bay. And Florida is famous for Disneyland, but what most people don't make their way out to is, God, now what's it called? It's called like Crafty Land or something. It's this amazing house. Maybe I can actually pull this up and just, it's this amazing house made by two artists who have decorated every inch of it with mosaics and murals. Their car is decorated. I was going to talk about Solomon's Castle. Do people know Solomon's Castle? That's a true, unique, crazy place to, again, an individual artist. And Atlas Obscura focuses a lot on these kinds of outsider artist projects. But he found all these leftover aluminum printing plates from the newspaper, and they're these kind of beautiful, shining things. And so he started building this enormous castle out of them. And it became this like palatial home, and until he died a number of years ago, not that long ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, but he would give tours of that place all the way up to the very end, and he was kind of this incredible place. I was going to talk about the Christ of the Abyss statue that's been dropped into the bay. So you go scuba diving and you see this incredible sort of Jesus statue that's been there now for almost 50 years, or no, it's been there for over 50 years, so it's turned into this kind of artificial reef. I was going to talk about Neptune Bay, which is the giant underwater cemetery, where a lot of like dedicated divers and wreck explorers are buried. They're basically, you're cremated, you're put into an urn, and then it's put underwater. And there's like all this statuary down there, this incredible sculpture of a lion. And I was going to say that, like, obviously Florida is associated with wildlife, but what I think a lot of people don't realize is you guys have one of the world's largest wolf preserves. So you can see like 22 wolves, these incredible creatures that were basically saved from being killed in other, like out in the West and in Canada, wolves are sometimes apprehended, and instead of being killed, they ship them to this wolf preserve in Florida. So there's just more, you could go on and on and on. There's so much, like so close. And so if you get the chance, go on the site, just type in Florida and have a look around. I think you'll be surprised by some of the stuff that's actually like an hour or two away from here. All of these wonders are close at hand. And it is our job as people in this amazing, unusual world to open our eyes and see what's in front of us. So thank you so much for coming out and joining me. Sorry about the technical glitch there at the end. I had a great time talking to you.